One of the darkest ones was when I saw corporations getting praised because they started offering their female employees egg freezing. This is a dystopian novel. You're saying, oh, guess what? You get to totally postpone anything else besides work because we don't want you in your 20s or 30s to be distracted by something like love and marriage and family and relationship.
So welcome back to another episode of L Podcast. Today's guest is Timothy Carney, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and is the author of the new book, Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I think if you would have told people 5 or 10 years ago that we are in the midst of a fertility rate decline, most people would have told you that you were crazy. I think now it's become a little bit more accepted. I've done a few podcasts on it. In the United States, the fertility rate has been below replacement rate since 2009. In Europe, it's been below replacement rate since the mid to late 1970s. And globally, it's been on the decline since the 70s as well, except globally, it's a slightly above fertility rate. I believe it's about 2.3. Your book, Family Unfriendly, is part demography, part self-help book, and then part investigative journalism. So I just wanted to start with the demography part. Are people still surprised in 2024 that we are in the midst of a kind of I wouldn't know if population collapse is the right word, but certainly in a population decline that's been steadily going on in the U.S. for 15 years?
A baby bust, as I put it, because the actual population is growing due to both immigration and demographic momentum. The millennials have had a low birth rate, but there were so many of them. I was just like the boomers. The boomers were basically below replacement, but at 1.9, because there were so many of them, the population could still grow for a short period of time. And then Gen X, my generation, came in and saved the world for a few years. And then when we tried to hand the baton off to the millennials, they dropped it. And so let me put it this way. When I gave my book proposal, when I was hiring an agent, the agent I hired said he had no idea. He's sort of a liberal DC guy, very open-minded, obviously. And when he read the proposal, he had his assistant. He's like, "Can you check these numbers? It just does not sound right to me that we have a low and falling birth rate in the United States, because all my friends tell me that we have an exponentially expanding population and a rising birth rate, yada, yada." So that was in 2021. By 2024, it's just sort of the commenters on the Washington Post website who don't believe it. Europe was attuned to the low and falling birth rate before the U.S. was, but in the last couple of years, it really has become something that, we can talk about without sounding like we're some Handmaid's Tale story or something like that.
And since we're still on the topic on demography, if you were to tell a lot of people that we are at some point going to have way less people, a population collapse at some point, a lot of people would be like, "Oh, that's good. Housing prices are going to fall, and I'm going to be able to go to this place without waiting in line and things." And, when I talk to people, it's like the actual more realistic picture is go look at like Detroit, because that's really what would happen. But Can you kind of explain like what would actually happen if this does come to fruition at some point in the U.S.?
So there's a couple things. One, in the short term, we'll have what Japan has now. Japan's population has just barely started to decline, but for the last generation, they've had a constantly shrinking labor supply and a constantly growing number of retired people. So that's the most basic economic argument. I don't think it's the most interesting, but I start with it because it's most sort of material, most concrete. So the economists call it the dependency ratio, the number of workers compared to the number of retirees. It's a relevant number here. And as that goes up, it doesn't matter how much money you save for retirement if there's nobody to answer the phone when you call for your leaky pipes. In counties around the country, they're desperately looking for new 911 dispatchers because they can't staff it. That's a problem. If it takes longer for the ambulance or the fire truck to get there because there's not enough people, that's a problem. Now, technology can replace some of it. Maybe we're at the point where artificial intelligence can route a fire truck. Right now, I would not trust ChatGPT to send the right truck to the right house on that score. But also, you lose amenities. So in all parts of rural America, I have this favorite town in Iowa, Imogene, Iowa, that lost its Catholic school and then it lost its public school. And sometimes they're afraid they're even going to lose their Irish pub, which is just absolutely beloved. And they still have a Catholic parish and a softball tournament, but those are both kind of shrinking. That's not okay. You could say, oh, you could just go to the next town. But this is what, for generations of people you've grown up loving, those things will disappear. Maybe the line will get shorter at your favorite barbecue joint and your favorite cocktail bar won't be as crowded. But the broader story is that those things will start disappearing as there's fewer people. And then after the boomers die off and our whole population starts shrinking, that's when you'll see it. Small towns will get a visit from the state government saying, we can't afford to keep the electricity on. This is what happens in rural Japan in places. And you're going to have to move out. So that's the long story. I think there's more important things than just those material, which is it just becomes a sadder place to live. Like, you have to believe me on this, that a world with fewer kids, people don't think of kids as much. And so the idea of getting married and starting a family becomes a more distant idea. It then snowballs downhill and people are married less. People are connected less. People know their neighbors less. That's the real story for me.
I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and kind of in farm country. I had classmates that had 12 siblings. And every time I go back visit, the populations of all the towns I drive through is less than it was when I was a kid. And I'm 41. So, I mean, I've been out of high school for almost 25 years now. And it's amazing when I drive through these towns, like this places I used to go, they're closed. And then it's funny because, like, you know, where I live, people are like, oh my God, like this town is so crowded now, talking about when I was living in Colorado or Puerto Rico, whatever. And it's just like, yeah, you should be happy. Like, there's actually like,
it's a problem of success.
It's a problem of success, not the opposite. And when I go back, it's just depressing when I go back home.
No, and in the rural communities, and I've written about this before, a lot of times it's like just the way farming is done. Tractors became much more powerful, much more expensive, and farms became bigger. So you used to have 9 kids working on 100 acres, and now you have a farmer with 1 or 2 kids farming 1,000 acres. And so that's its own unique cause of shrinking population. But that is it's an image, it's a peek into the future of what America as a whole will be like. And again, there are other countries that are already facing this story.
Your book, Tim, is called, I'll just read the full title, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. And that's a big theme of your book, is it's just a lot harder to raise kids now in 2024 than it was when you were a kid. And you're a Gen Xtra, as you mentioned. And it kind of reminded me, I was listening to a podcast with Abigail Schreiber, and she's basically a latchkey kid. And she's like, all of us Gen Xers and some of the older millennials were latchkey kids, and now we became helicopter parents because this is the childhood we really thought we wanted, when in fact we didn't want this, but this is what we thought we wanted because our parents are never there. So since the subtitle is How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be, I mean, how much harder is it than when you were a kid?
Well, part of it is those expectations and the demands that we place on ourselves, a lot of which are unnecessary. So to some extent, it's harder because we make it harder. And millennial parents or Gen X parents, some of them, they think they have to be there. I conducted a focus group for Family Unfriendly, and there was a couple women who said, I don't want to be a parent until I know I can be there for everything. I don't want to be an absentee parent. I don't want to miss a ballet practice or something. And I just thought, there's somewhere in between absentee parent and be there for absolutely everything. And that's a lot of what we older millennials and Gen X and certainly older generations had, which was our average day was after school was you do your homework, you do your chores, and then you're free. In the summer, come home when the street lights turn on. But, you know, our parents aren't skipping our high school graduation. They're at home, and we're having dinner as a family multiple nights a week at home. But also our parents weren't giving us travel baseball. Every baseball team I played on, I had to be able to ride my bike to the field. And there were other parents who knew that. And the parents who loved going to the games, they said, okay, meet at the field and we'll drive you to the game and then return you to the field and you'll ride your bike home. And this was the norm, that not everybody had to go to everything. And a lot of things could just be lower key, more local, more recreational. Nowadays, you talk about a rec baseball league, they say, oh, well, the coaches there are just volunteer dads. Well, that's fine. Because the point of youth sports is not to turn me into some stud outfielder. It's because baseball is fun and it develops all sorts of virtues. So a lot of the problems are self-imposed. Helicopter parenting being like a Secret Service agent there every minute. It's either irrational fears that everybody's a kidnapper, or it's just this is the expectation. And I don't want other people to think I'm a shirker because I'm not hovering over I'm reading my newspaper on the bench halfway across the park instead of hovering over Davey every minute as he walks around the park. Then there are actual ways in which it's harder. So as suburbs have been built in America, they're built more for cars, which is good if you have a car. But if you're a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 6-year-old, you don't drive. So then mom and dad need to drive you absolutely everywhere, to your friend's house, to the local pickup basketball game, to the elementary school. And that just becomes a lot less freedom for the kids, a lot more hassle for the parents. And so those are things that they're not parental choice. We find ourselves in a world that makes us exert more effort to do things that used to be easier.
You had several themes throughout the book about why we're having less kids now, at least in the US. And one of them was just the decline in religion, really regardless of what religion it is. But the one thing I really thought was interesting is you have a subtitle called The Church of Workism. I'll just read a little section from your book, but you say that workism is the belief that work is not only necessary to economic production, but also the centerpiece of one's identity and life's purpose. And then as Thompson defines it, you write, work for the elite has transformed from a way to earn money to a source of meaning, promise, identity, transcendence, and community. And I think that, parents also basically raise their kids almost in that same vein as well, where they're looking at it as an investment. So you're going to have less investments, as you kind of mentioned, and put more time into that investment, and everything just becomes about work. I grew up in the 80s. My mom could get off work whenever she needed to. And now with just like menial jobs, they expect your whole life revolves around some shitty job. That aspect, I think, is really under talked about.
No, it's exactly right. I mean, and I'm a moderate on work. I don't think work is just a way to earn a paycheck. I told the story in a recent article how one guy told me that it was bad that my employer allowed us to eat lunch like for a discount at the office because they were trying to exploit us. Work is just about an exchange of money for labor. I thought that's not right. And then I remembered I knew this guy who whenever a young, like an entry-level guy would leave, he'd be like, he'd feel all heartbroken. And then one day he said, this company is my family. And I thought, all right, can we be in the middle? Can we be in a point where work is a place where we get meaning, but we all acknowledge, including the boss, acknowledges that other things are more important. And I put family and faith as the two obvious ones that are more important than work. And I've always been blessed to work in, the Washington Examiner is where I write my columns. American Enterprise Institute supports my books. And in both of those places, my bosses all know work is more important than family. There's a big annual State of the Institute speech here at AEI. And I texted the boss. It's like, hey, I have to supervise my son's whitewater rafting trip. Like, there's no way he'd be like, oh, Tim, come on. You should be at work instead of whitewater rafting with your son. And so that attitude has been growing where either people invest their whole identity in work or just bosses think, well, your personal life is your own problem and I'm not going to accommodate it. They're almost two opposite things there, right? One is where work becomes too deep to our meaning, and the other is where work becomes totally depersonalized. And I do think that that's worse. But also, I think that what our schools, high schools and colleges are teaching kids is to only think about work. And I don't think it's intentional. I think it's because talking about family is a little too personal. If you say to people like, do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids? First of all, 18-year-olds might have no idea. B, it's sort of a value judgment. So they leave that off to the side and they just focus on what's your career going to be. That's fine. But if that just drives home the idea, that is what adulthood is. Adulthood is career and work with nothing else, then you're really leaving people with a misguided impression.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's like the Google plexification of the workforce, where it's like they have these beanbag chairs and they serve dinner and all this stuff, but it's not really to the employee's benefits. It's basically so that you'll never leave the complex, and they'll serve dinners at like 8 o'clock at 8 p.m. That way you don't get home till 10. If they really wanted to benefit you, they'd be serving it at 4 or 5 and you'd be home at a reasonable time. But they want you to stay and have no life.
No, and one of the darkest ones was when I saw corporations getting praised because they started offering their female employees egg freezing. egg freezing and unlimited free birth control. And I thought, this is a dystopian novel. You're saying, oh, guess what? You get to totally postpone anything else besides work, because we don't want you in your 20s or 30s to be distracted by something like love and marriage and family and relationship. And so it's absolutely an issue. One of the stories I tell in Family Unfriendly is of this consulting firm where they couldn't figure out why women weren't becoming partner. Like they did everything they could, maternity leave, nursing lounge, extra recruiting women, yada, yada. And in the end, they found, well, actually everybody's miserable, but the men just deal with the misery and they sacrifice their family. And the women are more likely to say, you know what, this isn't worth it. The mothers are more likely to say, this isn't worth it to lose as much time with our family. And there's this one quote from a woman who said, I think there's sexism, but it's even me. When I see a woman leave as early as 6 p.m., I assume she's leaving early to go home to dinner. 6 p.m. is not leaving early. But if I see a man leave at 6 p.m., I assume he's going to a work dinner. And I just thought, well, if she's right, then the woman is doing the right thing. And by the way, again, 6 p.m. shouldn't count as leaving work early. And so when the consulting firm was told by these gender scholars, actually, no, it's not a sexism problem at your company. It's that work is hell for everyone. They said this wasn't what we were looking for. We just wanted to find a way to make it so that women didn't leave. In other words, we want to find a way to make it that women never chose family over us.
The replacement rate is 2.1, and the U.S. right now, I believe, last time I checked, was about 1.7. So we're quite a bit
down to 1.62 now. Yeah,
is it 1.62?
Yeah.
But that's for all 50 states, and if you want to, put Puerto Rico in, I think Puerto Rico might even have the lowest fertility rate in the whole U.S. But there are exceptions. You have the Mormon populations in Utah, the Jewish population in kind of the New York Northeast area. The whole state of South Dakota, I believe, is also above the replacement rate. So there are sections in the U.S. and in the U.S. specifically in the 1970s, the U.S. also fell below the replacement rate. And then in the late 80s and the 90s, it actually got above it again. Are we going to see more places like the Jewish community? I mean, the Amish community, I guess I forgot that. And the Amish community is quite a bit above the replacement rate as well. And liberals or Democrats have the least amount of kids, and these other more conservative groups have the most. So at some point, they'll have a bunch of conservative kids that will then have that spillover effect of, your neighbors are impacted by what you're doing. If it's easy to have kids, like you mentioned, then you're going to be more likely to have kids. You mentioned this about the whole thing in Israel, or even secular Israelis have more kids just because it's like, well, everyone else is having kids. I mean, they have less, but they still have above the replacement rate.
Pregnancy is contagious. So while we have a broadly family-friendly culture, there are many family-friendly subcultures in the U.S. And you just named a lot of the ones: Mormon, Orthodox Jewish. I mean, my own subculture, which doesn't show up on a map, is sort of Irish conservative Catholic mixed with a bunch of South American Catholics. And if we individual couples were scattered around the country, maybe we'd be normal and have 2 or 3 kids. But instead, we all have 6 to 9 kids. Half of us drive like those hotel shuttle vans that seat 15 people. We call them Catholic assault vehicles, because if we see one on the street, we're like, oh, that's probably one of our friends. And so if the demographic question that you're asking is, if we're having 6 kids and the Orthodox Jews are having 6 kids and the Mormons are having 4 kids, while the atheist liberals are having 0 or 1, is there some point where the whole ship turns around? I think that's a really interesting question. I almost want to tell because I care about everybody I think everybody's happier. That would be a great scare story to scare the secular liberal readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post into having more kids. Like, you don't want everybody who has kids to look like me, do you? The question is, how much are the values and the community ties transmitted down the line? I don't have an answer to that, but what I do address in the book is sort of, again, how does this happen? How do people, families, couples, women, especially because they are the gatekeepers historically and biologically, how do these preferences for larger families get transmitted? And it is not primarily through like sermons about the catechism and birth control It is not primarily through sort of rational discourse or moral teachings. That's why I say pregnancy is contagious. This is kind of normal. But it's also through an anthropology. Like, do you see people as fundamentally good? What is the purpose of people? And so those things do get passed down, but not perfectly. So Lyman Stone is a demographer I cite like 20 times in my book. And he doesn't think there's a future 200 years down the line where the population is suddenly growing because the fecund subcultures have grown to be a majority, because he thinks that modernity just sort of knocks enough kids off of the bandwagon of the parents. I would add to that another thing, which is that these family-friendly cultural forces can sort of crowd out the family unfriendly forces can crowd out the family-friendly subculture. It's impossible to buy a house anywhere near mom and dad. Oh, I want to be raising kids and be near my parents and be having backyard barbecues like mom and dad, but I got to buy townhouse way out at like 5 counties away. Suddenly you're not close to your parents. So I'm dodging your question because I don't know the answer, but I'm saying that's one reason why that might not be the future.
Since you brought up finance, there's another quote I found interesting from your book, and you write, contrary to self-perception, millennials are exactly as wealthy as the previous 2 generations were at their age when adjusted for inflation. The millennial generation had the same per capita wealth in 2020 when the median millennial was 32 years old as Gen X had in 2007 when the median Gen Xer was 32, end of your quote. And as you mentioned, a lot of, from kind of your investigative journalism part, when you would talk to a lot of these people in their 20s, they would always cite kind of economic reasons, but then you're saying that it's basically identical to the last couple of generations.
Basically, not entirely. To give, the last 3 years have seen this massive explosion in home prices and rents. That is an economic force that is again and again proven to be anti-family. And I point to studies in England where everybody's mortgage is a variable rate. So when the interest rates go up, the house payments go up. 9 months after interest rates go up, births go down. Partly because people can't buy a bigger house, but partly because people's budgets get pinched. So that is actually true for the younger millennials. Because by now, most millennials are past the point where the average one has had a chance to buy a house. For the younger millennials, for the older Gen Z, it's true that like the idea of even renting a 2-bedroom together with your husband is more difficult. But the bigger picture is, yes, it is not less affordable to raise kids. I look at economists who studied the amount of weeks of labor it would take the median adult male in like those years, age 25 to 40 or whatever. How many weeks does it take him to sort of afford a child by the official measures of the cost of raising a child? And that's actually getting easier for the median adult. I'm not talking about a couple with 2 incomes. I'm not talking about the average that works in the rich people. The median male, it's becoming easier for him to afford a child. So why does it feel so much more affordable? One reason is historically, we haven't had to pay for everything. I don't pay for everything. When we were a kid, we called my wife's younger sisters and they babysat for free or a discount or something like that. And now those same younger sisters, they call my oldest child to babysit for relatively cheap, or they call my wife. It happens all the time. You know, the younger ones, the more newlyweds, they want a getaway. So my wife goes and stays at their house and watches their kids, and I'm in charge of all of our kids. The reciprocity that comes with community, with extended family, with church membership, with knowing your neighbors, with a really strong public school. A lot of times, historically, we've gotten things not on the market, but through community connections. So the erosion of community connections makes life seem much more expensive because suddenly we're thinking, I have to pay for everything.
You talk a lot about these Northern European countries where a lot of people are always, or I guess you'd say more like people that lean left are always using Europe as an example, as like, oh, Norway does this, or Sweden gives you this free daycare or whatever. And yet I don't necessarily know if Europe's the best model to even look at. They've had a falling fertility rate well below replacement since the 70s. But I actually lived in Luxembourg for a while. One of my good buddies, he moved there, and they have a couple of kids with his wife who's from Slovakia. You know, and Luxembourg's one of the richest countries in the world. And Luxembourg generally is considered to have the best benefits for children. I mean, they get paid for every child. They get free food for everybody. You can use it to buy alcohol and other things like that. The subway's free. Daycare is free. And you get maternity leave. I believe it's 18 months for the wife and a year for the husband. And you can take it like the first 3 years. So you can pick and choose when you want to take it. Like, it's very flexible, yet Luxembourg has a fertility rate even below that of Europe in general. And Europe already has a low fertility rate. And you mentioned how these programs don't really work, and it's not really incentivizing anyone to have more kids.
Yeah. It's why I put the word culture in the subtitle of the book. Because if you had a government spending policy that actually changed the culture, I think it could work. But a lot of them don't. They just change the finances of people who were already going to have kids. And I'm not going to complain too much about that, but it's not going to work to turn your birth rate around. So France is, let me put it this way. When it comes to spending money, France is the most efficient. That's why they have, now it's fallen since my book came out, but their birth rate was 1.8, the highest in Europe. Even if you take out, or it's 1.9, and even if you take out all the immigrants who have a higher birth rate, it's 1.8. So native-born French people have a higher birth rate than any country in Europe. What do? Most of their pro-family stuff, it's not really free daycare. Their money is just spent on just giving large piles of money to parents. Here's a check when you had a baby. Here's a monthly check as a child allowance for everybody, for every child. They have what they call maternity leave, paternity leave, but it's really a stay-at-home mom benefit. With your third kid, it's basically 3 years. So if you have 6 kids, you have that, you have them in 10 years, like my wife and I did. My wife would be getting paid by the government for 12 years to be a stay-at-home mom. All of those things drive up the birth rate a tiny bit for a lot of money. And so if you're going to try to drive up the birth rate with money, free daycare for a variety of reasons is not the way to do it. Maybe like free healthcare for pregnancy and birth and newborns, that might help, because a lot of people just are terrified of medical prices because they don't know what they're going to be, right? I mean, this was us when we were having a baby. If the doctor who comes for the epidural, the anesthesiologist is out of network, like, boom, we have a $10,000 bill. So like removing those uncertainties might help, but really just giving people money. But that's super expensive. It also tends to deter marriage because of the way these benefits tend to be structured. And so it ends up not being family friendly in the long run. And so you really do need to change the culture. Do you think Japan isn't trying to turn the birth rate around? No, they've tried everything. China's now trying it. They successfully drove it down. Forced sterilization, subsidies, propaganda, forced abortions, all of their one-child policy drove it down. And now they're trying to turn this giant ship around, and they're not able to do that. So it's hard for central government policy to do that. There are policies I advocate in the book that will help, but I don't think they'll help more than a ton unless we also change the culture.
What are some of those policy recommendations that you think will move up that birth rate?
I guess I could answer by saying like big picture things. What do we already do as a government policy that shifts wealth from people in the family formation period of life to a later period of life? Well, for one, Social Security takes money from workers and gives it to retirees. There's an argument for that, but it is proven to drive down birth rates. I cite a study doing that in my book. Two, we have taxes when you buy a house, and then we have tax breaks that you kind of get paid back over the years. So your mortgage interest being deductible, that drives up the price of a home because it increases your ability to afford a home, but it drives up the price, and then you slowly get paid back for that subsidy while you own the home. And then again, when you sell it, that's shifting wealth from your 20s and 30s to your 50s and 60s. And that's not what we should be doing. We should want people who are in that stage of life where they could be getting married and starting a family to keep as much of their money as possible. Now, sometimes it's just the free market that does it. A 50-year-old is going to get paid more than a 22-year-old and more than a 30-year-old. So should we be transferring money the other way? That's a tougher question, but the easy question is let's stop transferring money the longer way. But really, if you said, what policies would I do, specific policies, I would say a lot of it's going to be on the local level. And it's going to be like more crosswalks, more sidewalks, more playgrounds, let the kids play on the field and the basketball court, even if it's not a league, if it's just a pickup game. Liberating kids to run the neighborhood sounds like 1990s nostalgia or something, but it's actually really important. The Journal of Pediatrics just came out and said there is an epidemic of childhood anxiety, and the main cause is that kids don't get to play unsupervised enough. Everything is an organized sport supervised by an adult. They don't learn how to sort of make their own rules, make their own decisions, deal with adversity, decide what to do next. And so that's really one thing that I would just say is make every community as easy as possible for parents to just let the kids out the front door and say, come back for dinner.
Pretty much every country, as they get richer, they have less kids. And also as they get more urbanized, they have less kids. This is, of course, globally. And even Israel, their fertility rate has fallen over the years as well, even though it's still above replacement rate. So, culture is more important for actually curbing this than policies are. A lot of the policies, like you mentioned, a marginal effect. One thing I was wondering now with college enrollment on four-year universities is going down and more kids are going to trade school. Well, if you go to a trade school, you're going to be done a lot sooner. You'll be making money younger. And you're more likely to get married if you have money younger. The pendulum, I feel like, always swings. Like in the 60s, really high birth rate, down in the 70s, and then 80s it picked up. Now we're going down, but with more kids going to trade school and getting out younger.
Maybe. It's hard to tell. The public opinion polls of Gen Z is that family is not on their mind. But also, you're right. The idea that four-year college is definitely a good bet for everybody. The problem is that the studies keep proving that it's great for everybody, when really the question is the marginal kid, the kid who's kind of super relieved when he takes his last final exam and doesn't like academics. He's also told to go to college. Or the kid who already has some skill, whether it's computer programming or, with a saw in his hands and a wrench. Those kids are still being told to go to college because for the average college goer, it pays off, which is bad logic. And we need to figure out more because to some extent, it's not good if your kid just, at age 18 is like, I'm not going to college. I'm just going to find myself. And he hops in a VW bus and he drives around the country. Maybe that's good, but it's probably not. I knew a guy who got pressured into going to college. And finally, he dropped out when he was like, all I'm going to do is drink and maybe get a girl pregnant. And so he went to work for his dad's auto glass company, and now he's a firefighter. It was definitely not the right thing for him to go. So if that pendulum swing really is happening, you're exactly right. One of the big things that drives birth rates and family formation is, can a working class guy pay the bills? Can a 24-year-old guy without a college degree, with no college experience, so that means A, hopefully he has no student debt because he didn't do the 1 year and drop out. But B, he's been in the workforce for 6 years. For a lot of my friends, they were in the workforce for 6 years at age 32 because they had master's degrees, or age 40 because they had PhDs. But this guy's 24 and he has some experience. The baby booming part happened because the military, I don't want to send these guys off to war, but the military, the war, all of that had kind of made these guys grown up, and then they land a job. And they're ready to hit the ground running. So the failure to launch, the delay in adulthood is one of the big things driving down the birth rate. Is if you're not starting until your mid-30s, if you want 3 kids, you're just increasing the likelihood you don't get that. But also, if men can get jobs without a college degree and that job can pay the bills, that would absolutely do it. Is that in the future? I mean, you're hopeful, and I hope you're right.
Well, also, it's like if you're a kid now, if you're a junior, sophomore, or senior in high school, and you're wondering what the future is going to look like in 10 years with the AI, you don't have an AI bot replacing a plumber or an electrician or a nurse anytime soon. Maybe in 100 years or something, but they can replace an attorney, and quote unquote, the knowledge economy can be replaced fairly easily, whether that's 10, 20 years, who knows? But I would hope that these guidance counselors, and I don't necessarily think guidance counselors are the best because they, of course, never got a real job their entire life and don't really work in the business sector and know what's going on. You're like, man, those teachers were probably not the people I should have been taking career advice from. But I would hope that they have some parents or some mentors when they're young that are actually having them think about these issues, because I do think we're going to see a lot more people going to school for a much shorter time. And like you said, if you got money when you're 24, you're more likely to settle down.
But then you're cutting against the culture so hard there. I mean, if you go into the average suburb where somebody paid a lot of money to send their kids to the best school, and even if their kid is, getting by with a gentleman's C, they're still thinking, what college are they going to go to? And if you try to say, you know what, Davey's like, maybe he should, get an actual trade job, take a few years off, and maybe go to community college down the line, but probably try to get a job now. You're basically saying your child should be in the underclass. It cuts against their self-understanding. And so that's a pretty hard cultural lift. I mean, it's one of the reasons we write books and we do podcasts, right? To try to sort of pick at people's brains and change their mind and expand their imagination. But there's a lot of work to do on that front.
I think you're right. The self-anointed elites, whatever you want to, they call themselves whatever. But you're talking at most like 10, 15% of the population. I don't think anything's going to change their mind. But those are people that generally have less kids anyways. But the working class people, the people that have a decent job but aren't on that, again, quote unquote, self-anointed elite, I think they will be the ones that do have kids younger.
And that's the majority of the population.
Yeah. And that's the majority of the population anyways. Yeah.
No, I think you're right.
Also in your book, you say that pretty much every poll that's been done says that women in self-reported polls say they want about 2.7 kids, but the reality is they only have 1.7 kids. So people do want more kids. And I remember in your book where you were talking about this girl that was in like a New York Times article saying she never wanted to have kids. And then you contacted her like 5 years, 6 years later. And then she's like, oh yeah, like I was young, I was dumb. Of course I want kids now, And that's the thing too. As you mature a little bit, I have so many of my ex-girlfriends and people I used to date that are like, I'm never having kids. And now they're all like, have kids. And they're like, yeah, like I just changed my mind. I was young, it's totally true though.
It's so, this girl was literally the cover girl of this New York Times piece. Millennials aren't having kids and they told us why. And it's a picture of her playing with her cat. And the article says like she wants more time, and to play with her cat, and mentions her fiance. And she wrote back, she's like, yeah, the fiance was a bad guy. And that's why I didn't want to have kids. I was stupid. And now I'm married to a good guy or marrying a good guy and I want to have kids. And so that is my hope. Again, when I look at the Gen Z polls, I see a total disinterest in marriage and family. And you look at the media and there's constantly people railing against it. Marriage is a white supremacist institution is what Teen Vogue says. So that was like an article 4 years ago. So the kids now in college, the girls now were reading as teenagers that marriage was white supremacist. So who wants to be a white supremacist? So that's my worry, is that has sunk in. Not just that career should come first, but that marriage is actually a bum deal. And men are told that too. So a big part of the manosphere is like, if you get married, you're going to make a lot of money. Your wife's going to cheat on you, divorce you, and take all your money. Like that. I get that every time on Twitter when I talk about marriage, some anonymous account says that to me. I was like, this is not the norm. This is not how most marriages end. Even the marriages that end in divorce don't end the way that Andrew Tate is telling you or whatever. So you do have this propaganda against marriage. And so when I see these polls of Gen Z not interested in, I'm thinking, hopefully they're just going to age out of that. Because millennials, as you said, they do want kids. And so that's one of the reasons when people say, why do you care that other people aren't having kids? I've got a dozen, but one of them is because they want kids and they're falling short of their ideal on something that's not like materialistic. Like my ideal house, I would say, has a big front porch that I can sit on and the neighbors walk by and I invite them up for a lemonade and an iced tea or a beer or coffee. Nobody's going to care that I don't get my ideal house. Nobody's going to write a book about you and I not getting our ideal houses. But family's something more important than these materialistic ideals. And if we're really falling that far short from 2.7 to 1.62 as a culture, well, that's something to worry about.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about religion and you're religious, but basically you're saying that people that are religious, and I think at least go to church, whether it's the mosque, synagogue, or whatever, at least once a week, they have 2.2 kids. And then for the non-religious, have 1.4, maybe, say the atheist. And then the ones that are kind of in between are also maybe go to church once a month. They're in between those two numbers. I used to live in Denver and I was friends with this Mormon girl and I went to church with her and I was interested to see how they separated. But like if you're married and with kids, you go to the family church. As soon as you graduate high school and turn 18, you're then kicked out of the family church, and then you go to a single church. So then all like the single people are together. And I went to a Mormon speed dating thing, which was actually pretty interesting. You kind of mentioned this in the book, but I don't think many people know, but Mormons have like 3 layers of heaven. But to get to the highest layer of heaven, you actually have to be married and have kids. And I think it's called like the bleed out rate, which is basically like how many of the Mormons' kids will be Mormons. And it's like a pretty high percentage. It's like something like 75% or around that still hold the faith, not as high as Amish. Amish is like 90% of Amish. The kids will then also be Amish. Like it's a very tight culture. As these religions kind of get like this momentum, it just is, it becomes unstoppable. If one family has 8 kids for 10 consecutive generations and each of their families have 8 kids, after 10 generations, it's over a billion descendants. I understand, like, you know, a lot of them are, but you can see how like one family or one cult can really populate almost the world.
Oh no, I know guys, old guys who are in their late 80s or 90s who don't know all their grandkids' names because they have 100 of them. And an interesting thing is because the Mormons live healthier and they get married younger, like knowing your great grandfather too is a real thing there in a way that it never has been world historically. But like, you know, hanging out with them and going fishing with great grandpa can be a thing. Mitt Romney is in good health and he's got great grandchildren. But again, I don't know what's going to happen with the demographics in the future, but an interesting thing, one of the pushbacks I get when I talk about, I want to help people, more people get married to have kids. They say, well, not everybody wants it. As you said at the beginning there. And in my faith, there's always been an acknowledgement, as we would put it, not everybody's called to marriage and parenthood. And so priests, monks, nuns, but even outside of that, all sorts of other sort of religious callings, you marry the church instead of a spouse, and you don't have kids. I think that's an acknowledgement of just human nature. And so when we talk about demography, if suddenly I got appointed in, you know, somebody in Hungary calls me and says, you're going to be the Secretary of Family, what are you going to do? I would say, okay, who are the people who are already oriented towards marriage and family? And how can we help them do this sooner and bigger? That would be again, I'm not confident that anything in a government program would work, and that is some of what Hungary is asking. Is, okay, you got a married couple, they have 1 kid. What's in the way of them having a second and a third and a fourth? Let's address that. Because nudging somebody, and this is some of the liberal critique of traditional cultures is, and this would be a critique of Mormonism, if nudging everybody to get married and have kids is nudging people to do kind of what they weren't built to do. They're different personality types. They're different, as I would put it again, callings in life. Like I knew I was going to be a dad. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a dad. The reason girls didn't date me in high school is because I reminded them of their dad. And so like it was definitely my calling. But there are some people who just ultimately, you know, their day-to-day just, they need, so one person told me, it's like, I need about 90 minutes when I first wake up of not being disturbed before I can deal with people. Well, if that's really true and not just sort of self-indulgence, if that's really true, then yeah, you're probably not called to have a husband or have kids. And that's always going to be some subsection of the population. So acknowledging that, I do that explicitly to try to get some people off their heels and say, I'm not saying you have to have a bunch of kids or have kids at all, but there's a lot of people who are already disposed that way. Let's push them further. But I do also want to help convince some people, you know, starting when you're in high school, start thinking about family as something that you really will get value from.
Your subtitle's How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. That was a big theme throughout the book. And it's just so much harder to have kids nowadays. You've mentioned some of the things. We like live in this culture of safetyism. I lived in Colorado ski towns for years. And when I was younger and I would go snowboarding, no one would wear a helmet. And like, I still don't wear a helmet when I go. And like, there's people that I've never met ream me out. And it's like, what are you, my dad? Like, shut the fuck up. I don't need to have some person I don't know chastising me about wearing a helmet. But it's like you mentioned with the car seats. And the same thing when I was a kid. Okay, just jump into the back of the station wagon, whatever. Now it's like, oh, okay, you got to have this car seat that takes forever to put in. If you're going to stop at 3 different stores, you got to take them out 3 separate times. You're like, well, maybe I'll just leave them in the car. But then someone's going to call the cops on you because you left them in the car. So you can't do that. And that's just one example. But it's like you're saying, you can't walk to school. There's a lot of school districts, they won't pick up kids on the bus for the first 2 miles. So then it's like, well, how do I drop the kids off at school? Because the bus won't pick them up. But then I have to go to work. It's just gotten harder to have kids. And like, I think a lot of it is like this safetyism culture. Do you think we've hit peak safetyism and it'll just be,
I do.
easier to have kids from that standpoint?
This is a way. Now I was a little worried because I worked on this book for 2.5 years, and that's when we had the post-COVID crime wave. But in most of the country, that's receding. Not all of the country, unfortunately. DC and some of its suburbs, it's still there and it's flat or rising. But in most of the country, that post-COVID, post-George Floyd crime wave is on its way out. There are people, and actually I find this more among conservatives, who believe that there's a massive wave of people kidnapping girls into sex trafficking because they read about sex trafficking and they assume it's average high school girl was at the mall and gets nabbed and thrown in the back of a bus, when it's really more like illegal immigrant girl with no father and his mother's a drug addict who gets caught up with a bad crowd. But so there are people who really do believe the worst case scenarios of these things are going on. But in general, you've seen in a lot of states, they had laws on the books for years because one bad thing happened. You can't leave a 13-year-old to babysit her younger siblings. You have to be at least 14. It's just totally insane stuff. Like you can't be at home alone for any period of time until you're 12. Those laws are getting rolled back. And in fact, Utah and other states have passed that you call them free-range parenting laws, that a parent can't get in trouble for doing something that's not unsafe. It sounds ridiculous that you have to say that, but it's happening. And I have gotten I've gotten lots of pushback on my book. I say we need more stay-at-home moms. I say travel sports are crazy. I say a lot of these things I get people pushing back and telling me I'm dead wrong. Almost nobody has said, oh, actually, we need to be more protective of our kids. Almost everybody has said, yeah, you're right. We've gone overboard in this regard.
What are some of the biggest things people have pushed back on then?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the biggest one, I ran a piece in the Washington Post saying, make your life easier, have at least 4 kids. And this is one of the arguments in my book, is that when you get past 3, you stop trying to do everything for them. And the older kids can do stuff for the younger kids. This is actually really problematic in a lot of people's views, that to have an oldest child take on responsibilities, like have the 10-year-old change the baby's diaper, have the 14-year-old babysit the younger kids, have the 12-year-old boy mow the lawn. A lot of people saying, you're parentifying these kids. You're robbing them of their youth. No, I'm giving them very discrete tasks that they can handle for short periods of time. That's helping them grow up. It's robbing them of their youth is constantly supervising and not letting them experience the world and make up their own dumb games. So some of the letters to the editor in the Washington Post were saying, no, you shouldn't have that many kids. And one of the other reasons was probably the biggest pushback is this. The world is going to hell. It's on fire. Climate change is a big problem. So A, you're bringing kids into a world that is going to be unlivable in 10 years because of climate change. And B, every kid adds to the greenhouse gas emissions. Just exhaling for 80 years is bad enough. So that's the biggest pushback. And that's where I ended the book. And the last couple of chapters is that idea that people are bad and the world is doomed. And there's only so much I can convince somebody who believes that.
Yeah, I went to this Spanish immersion school in Costa Rica for 6 months. And the principal at the school was like, you can always tell when an American is coming versus, say, someone from Europe or Australia or New Zealand or one of these other countries. And it's because the 19 or 20-year-old or 21-year-old will never call. It will be the mom. And then, she's like, but if it's like a 16-year-old coming from France or something, the 16-year-old will set everything up themselves.
One of the things when I was a kid, I remember I got this job and I was lucky, my older brother lined up this lawn mowing job. So when he graduated, it handed down to me. So in some ways it was just put in my lap. One day the family who lived across town was away and I went to mow the lawn on Saturday and their mower wouldn't start. And so I went inside and I called. I said, Mr. Zellinger, your mower doesn't start. And he goes, well, here's the thing. The good news is we're not having company over until Monday evening. It's Saturday at noon, and you are resourceful enough to figure out how to get my lawn mowed by Monday evening. And then he said, all right, let me know when it's done. And I just realized my whole life I'd had mostly assignments, but now I had a responsibility. And this was just a key growing up thing. But if we're always just giving kids assignments, it's not that they're always super easy. I mean, calculus is hard. Kids are taking calculus, but it's always an assignment. And so let them go free, and they'll end up in a situation where they have to somehow solve the problem. And that, for me, I remember, again, I was riding my bike around, and I borrowed my brother's bike, including the bike lock, and I got home and the keys were missing. And so my buddy was like, okay, I'll help you, because you were going to die if you lost your brother's keys, because then his bike lock is useless. That's $20. And so there was no ending until we found the damn keys. And we found them. And just that was this growing up experience that's so much safetyism. But it's not just safetyism that denies it. It's the overprogramming, the believing that the kid has to be doing the maximal enrichment at every point. Travel sports, piano, whatever. Ride your bike around town and be stupid for most of the summer. That doesn't seem like maximum enrichment to parents. I think it is. And by the way, Mike, my brother, if you're watching this and you're just hearing about this for the first time, you can lend me your bike again. I promise I won't lose the keys.
Another part was interesting where you're basically saying that the married people with children are actually, happier than single people without children. And it seemed like, you're mentioning one of the feminists, I forget her name, but basically is like telling women they shouldn't even be happy to stay home and have kids. Yet those are the same people telling you, oh, do what you love or whatever. Those are the people. But then it's like, if you do what you love, then you somehow are holding women back or whatever. It's the hypocrisy that's in that statement. It kind of bothers me. But how much happier are married people with children than those without?
I mean, it's significant that married people with children, on the whole, are happier than anybody else. And they're even happier than married people without children. And actually, on the whole, single people with children are happier than single people without, which is not what you would expect. There's a lot of single mothers whose lives are really, really difficult, but the average is actually more happy. The obvious point is just you have connections and you have friends, and we undervalue that. We think that if I have the right activities, if I have enough money, if I live in the right neighborhood, that those are going to be the determinants of my happiness. But just like having people around is really useful. This morning, my 9-year-old son just started belting out this. It's like a hymn that the seniors sing at high school graduation, or that the juniors sing for the seniors at high school graduation. So he heard his older brother practicing it. The older brother can actually sing. And then the 9-year-old starts belting it out. And it sounds ridiculous, but he's singing it with such fervor and such love. And it's this source of joy that I never would have thought of, imagined, planned, called some 9-year-old kid I knew and be like, sing this song for it. But it happened. Those sort of connections, and just it's why I say college was so fun, because you didn't have to plan things. Your roommates, your buddies, they were right around the corner. They were in the next room. That's what family is. And so that's one reason that people with families are happier. And yeah, there's a lot more going on. Like, I spent a lot of years cleaning up other people's bodily fluids. That was not fun. I didn't love that. But the price is worth it. Having buddies around all the time makes people happier.
I used to have this job when I lived in a Colorado ski town, and I had 4 months paid vacation, and I worked 4 10-hour shifts, so I had a lot of time off. So I would travel around the state, and I'd run into a lot of older people that never had kids, and I'd always ask them, like, what's the biggest regret of your life? And every single one was always like, I wish I had kids. There's not a single person that would, because I would, like, there's a lot of like natural hot springs in Colorado, and I would always like do these hot springs and stuff, and you're just kind of sitting there talking to people. But yeah, I've had to talk to well over 100 people that were like, oh yeah, the biggest regret that they're always like, wish I would have had kids.
No, I try not to focus on that. Yeah.
So today's guest is Timothy Carney. who is the author of the recent book, Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. So, Tim, thanks for joining us today. I have two final questions for you. One, where can people find you, find your book, anything that you've written, that kind of information? And then the final question is, leave us with a final thought.
My book is everywhere. Hopefully your local bookstore has it. If they don't, tell them to stock 10 copies. You can buy Family Unfriendly, obviously, online, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. The American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Examiner are my employers. You can find actually one of my book talks at AEI.org and at WashingtonExaminer.com, a lot of my stuff. And I tweet, for better or for worse, TP Carney. I think the sort of the final thought I would have is, I was just talking about how good it is just to have like buds, to have a crew. And that's the key. The main thing that makes our culture family unfriendly is that people don't belong to stuff as much. They don't know their neighbors. And I'd written an earlier book kind of about this. And I think that the retreat from family and from marriage and parenthood is the most important part of that. But I think in general, feeling of isolation, or whether it's political extremism, a lot of our problems flow out of the lack of belonging. And some of that is the shape of our culture. And some of that, though, is just that we forget that what matters. So my parting thought is just remember that. Join. If you're not religious, fine. I won't tell you to join a religious community, but get involved. Join something. Be a member, volunteer, give your time, and you'll find that it pays back much more than you put in.
And since Twitter's called X now, you're not really tweeting these days. Are you Xing? I mean, how do you convey that message?
Zing? Maybe it's just pronounced zinging. Yeah.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.